Hi, welcome to the All Things LGBTQ interview show, where we interview LGBTQ guests who are making important contributions to our communities.
All Things LGBTQ is taped at Orca Media in Montpelier, Vermont, which we recognize as being unceded Indigenous land.
Thanks for joining us and enjoy the show.
Hi, everybody. I'm here with Amy Hoffman. In her second appearance on the show, when she came 2 years ago, we talked about her novel, Dot and Ralphie. We had a lovely conversation, and Amy has agreed to join us again to talk about two of her earlier memoirs, Hospital Time and An Army of Ex-Lovers, My Life at the Gay Community News. So welcome, Amy.
Thank you.
For those of you who may have missed the last show, let me read Amy's bio, if I may. A writer, editor, and community activist, Amy Hoffman is the author of the novels Dot and Ralphie and The Off-Season, and three memoirs, Lies About My Family, An Army of Ex-Lovers, My Life at the Gay Community News, and Hospital Time. An Army of Ex-Lovers was shortlisted for a Lambda Book Award, and both An Army of Ex-Lovers and Hospital Time were shortlisted for the New York Publishing Triangle Judy Grahn Award. Hospital Time was also a New York Public Library Books for the Teenage selection and has been adopted in college and university courses. I'm really glad to hear that because it's a very important book. It is the subject of chapters in several works of literary criticism. Amy is currently a freelance editor, writer, and consultant. She was editor-in-chief of the Women's Review of Books for 14 years, from 2003 to 2017, and I'd love to read a memoir about that period. So I know you're constantly working on things, but she's a faculty member of the Solstice MFA program at LaSalle College. She's been an editor at Gay Community News, South End Press, and the Unitarian Universalist World magazine. She taught writing and literature at the University of Massachusetts in Emerson College, and that shows in the second memoir in particular, and served as development director for the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities and the Women's Lunch Place, a daytime shelter for homeless women. You mentioned that in An Army. Oh, I think in Hospital Time you're working on there.
Yes.
Her creative writing, feature articles, and reviews have appeared in the Boston Review, Gay and Lesbian Review, the Women's Review of Books, and other publications. Amy has a BA in English from Brandeis University and a Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Her activism has included working for peace with the Jamaica Plain Action Network and Jewish Women for Justice in Israel, Palestine, and volunteering with the Reproductive Rights Network and the Outright Lesbian and Gay Writers Conference. I never went to that conference, but I was able to read the book that Julie Enzer.
Yeah.
Fabulous. I'm so sorry I missed it, and good for you for working on it. You're a mover and shaker.
Well, all of those things are sort of, I should give you different information. Those are all old, but I did do them.
Oh, sure, of course. It's your bio. And we'll talk about your current work before we leave. So you worked at the Gay and Lesbian Advocates and Defenders and the Boston Lesbian and Gay History Project.
I was on the boards of those groups, and I wasn't a staff member.
Well, and also I have to give you credit because I interviewed Joan not long ago, and she gave you one wonderful feature about the GCN exhibit is the music. It's so cool. You're able to listen to music from that time, and she credited you and another person with putting together that music collection. It's such a gift to the community, so thank you. Right. As you write in Lies About My Family, you grew up in New Jersey, the oldest of 6 children, and you've lived in Boston since 1973. When you're not writing, you enjoy reading, playing the violin, bicycling, yoga, and hanging out with your wife, Roberta Stone, who also figures in both of these books. So welcome again.
Thank you.
How did you
Thank
happen
you
to
so
write?
much.
I'm sorry.
No, I just wanted to thank you for having me come on your show twice. Thank you very much.
And there are more interviews to come, I'm sure, because you're constantly working. How did you happen to write these two memoirs?
Well, I wrote Hospital Time was my first book, and I have to say when I first started working on it, I didn't have a plan to write a book. I had, I was working on it in the early 1990s, and I had several friends who were sick with AIDS, and I had been very involved in the care for the person I write about a lot in Hospital Time, Mike Riegel, who had been the office manager at Gay Community News. He and I started working there at about the same time and became friends, although he was a very difficult and eccentric person, but also brilliant and interesting and just kind of an amazing guy. So I started keeping a sort of a journal when he was sick, and also when after he died, I started writing about my experience of caregiving with him. And I know I put it in a folder at one point that said Mike Becomes Fiction, but I realized it wasn't fiction, it was really a memoir about him. And at the same time that I was writing about Michael, just sort of to straighten out my own mind, I was also keeping a journal about Walter Borowski, who was another friend of mine who eventually died of AIDS. He was the lover of Michael Bronski, who some people may know. He's a prolific writer and teacher and quite brilliant. And Walter was a poet and also a writer and just a watercolorist. He was just a beautiful man. And so I started writing. I originally thought that I would have sort of two streams of, in the book, you know, the sort of a past tense about Michael and a present tense about Walter, and also because they were such very different people, but struggling with the same illness. And that didn't happen. There's one chapter in the book in which I talk about Walter, but really most of it is focused on Mike and on the repercussions of his death and on the AIDS movement in Boston at the time. So my original thought for the book just didn't work out.
Well,
But it went somewhere else, which is usually the way it happens with books.
how about an army of ex-lovers? How'd you happen to write that?
Well, when I was in graduate school, I went to graduate school in creative writing, and my final project was I began working on a novel about Gay Community News. I had left it not that long before I went to graduate school, and I didn't really expect anyone to be particularly supportive or interested in my writing about queer stuff. It wasn't a time, it was the mid-1980s. It wasn't a time when I expected anyone to do that. And I was actually pleasantly surprised. I got a lot of interest and help from both some of my teachers and also my fellow students there. But anyways, I'd written about half of this novel for my graduate thesis and continued to finish it after I graduated. And then it kind of sat in a drawer. I sent it around and didn't get anyone taking it. And years later, I was talking to a younger friend of mine. I guess we had lunch, and he started asking me questions about gay community news, and I was telling him stories, and he said, "Oh, you should write all this." And I said, "Well, I don't know. I don't think people are interested in it right now." And he was very encouraging to me to do it. And so I went back to some of that material and decided that it really worked much better as a memoir. And sort of that's how that evolved.
I remember in hospital time, you mentioned going to Provincetown to write, and I think you were working on that novel about gay community news that you.
I may have been, yeah.
I'm really glad that you published it, though, because it's equally important. You mentioned in an interview that you're a slow writer. What's your writing process, and does it vary between memoir and fiction?
It has been different writing memoir and fiction. In terms of process, well, I've always had a day job. People think writers make a lot of money. They do not. I think of all of my publications, I may have made enough to go out for pizza with a couple of friends. And so I've always had a day job, and I've been lucky because I've always worked for marginal nonprofits, basically, but I've been lucky to be able to sort of shift my work hours so that for many, many years I woke up early in the morning and would write a couple hours before work and then go into work at around, 9:30 or 10. So that's
Impressive.
process. That was my process, I guess. I'm a morning person. I feel very sorry for myself if I have to do any writing work in the evening. So that actually seemed to work out best. I did find that it was different writing the memoirs and fiction. As I sort of described before, Hospital Time and all the others too, I kind of wrote in pieces, and only as I'd written many pieces did I begin to see sort of a whole arc and figure out how to fit all these pieces together. So it's not like I started at the beginning and wrote to the end, which I did do with the novels, or at least I thought I was. Like I wrote a draft that went from the beginning to the end. Of course, that's just the first step, and I do a lot of revising, and one of the reasons I'm slow is because despite what all the writing manuals tell people, I revise as I write, so I write very slowly. Writing manuals usually encourage students to write their first draft very quickly and sloppily and then go back and fix it, and there's sort of psychological reasons for advising that, but it's just not the way I work. And I've finally been admitting to my students that I don't do any of the things that that writers are supposed to do and that I'm advising them to do. So I don't write what Annie Lamott calls a shitty first draft. I don't keep a journal. Except at certain times in my life. I don't do all these things one is advised to do, but somehow I've managed to write anyways in the wrong way, I guess.
It works, though. That's the point.
It seems to work for me, yes.
Well, you've agreed to do a little reading from Hospital Time, so I thought maybe we could take a moment and ask you to do that.
Okay, I have to change my glasses. I got new glasses because I'm so nearsighted, but now I can't use them to see close. So, whatever. Okay, this is the introduction, basically the introductory section to Hospital Time. Time ticks by differently next to the sick bed. Nothing's happening, or maybe it's everything that's happening, or is about to, and there's no comfortable place to sit. The bed is narrow, the patient bristling with needles, electrodes, and other ICU accoutrements that must not be displaced. I've been reading up on accounts of terminal illness. Often visitors resort to massaging the feet, the only place on the body where contact is unimpeded. I sat on the edge of Mike's bed or on a stool or chair next to it and cupped my palm around his shoulder. Sometimes I held his hand, but often it was swollen from the IV taped into the back of it, and a blood oxygen monitor was clamped to one finger. We would speak when he was able. He would ask for things and I would get them. Or we would sit in silence and I'd wonder if I should say something profound, something appropriate to this most profound of situations. How are you doing? No answer. My neck would begin to ache, then my buttocks. My arm would fall asleep. I'd think of obligations elsewhere. I'd get bored. I'd wish I'd brought a magazine to look at. A magazine? Mike was struggling. He was dying, and he needed my total attention, my total palm on his shoulder. Some people believe in the laying on of hands, and they're not all religious fanatics either. Look at Mike's friends. Look at Loie, coming to visit Mike in the ICU at Beth Israel. She took his hand, and then she demonstrated Tai Chi for him. No sitting around on the bed for her. She stepped back into the room away from the monitors and began to move slowly over the linoleum. The monkey, the swan, pushing back the clouds, she explained, eyes closed. Her hands traced patterns in the air. Mike's eyes were closed too. He lay on his back facing the ceiling, his bony nose jutting like a monument out of his emaciated face. Air rushed and gurgled through his oxygen mask. In the hallway, the nurses ignored us, but the doors to rooms in the ICU are never shut, the curtains never entirely closed. I was aware that we might look ridiculous. I would shift my position slightly, and Mike would say, or not say, but I knew he was thinking, leave if you want. No, I'd say, I'm fine. I'd set goals. To stay until I'd helped Mike eat his lunch, until the nurse came to change the bed, until the doctor and his entourage kicked me out. Nothing happening. Everything happening. The minutes would tick by, stretch by, leap by, poke by, and I'd fluff up the pillows, demand another blanket to tuck around Mike's feet. He hated for anyone to see his feet. He thought they were terribly ugly. Fetch the bedpan or a cup of juice and a straw. The patient lies in the ICU and you charge in gabbing about the weather, which you have brought into the room. You shake the rain from your hair, or the cold air reddens your cheeks and clings to your coat, or sweat beads on your upper lip and dampens the hair on your temples. You draw the patient's attention to the view from the window, the time of day, the sun, the moon, the clouds. Your vigor, your life outside is an affront. It's utterly frivolous, the world and its stupid times. Here in the hospital is the real thing, eternity.
This is so good. It really nails it. It's so detailed and observant. And, you know, I haven't had a terminal illness, but I've spent time, for example, in the ICU and all those things, the uncomfortable chairs.
When I wrote the book, I got a lot of feedback from people who had not necessarily dealt with people with AIDS, but had friends or family who had serious illnesses. And they said basically what you were saying, that the experience transcends particular diseases.
Right.
At least that part of it.
Who do you want to read this book?
Well, at this time, I mean, the book came out in 1997, so that's a long time ago, and things have changed. When I first wrote it, I sent it to various people to comment on it, and I was surprised because Larry Kessler, who was the director of the AIDS Action Committee in Boston, said that he felt like the book was a piece of history and had captured a moment. And at the time, it didn't feel like a moment. It felt like this is our life. But he was absolutely correct. It was a very particular moment. And at this point, it's a moment that a lot of people don't know about or don't want to remember. So it's, I guess I hope that people who didn't experience some of this would read the book and understand what the AIDS epidemic was like for gay men and for LGBTQ people in general. And, the fact that we really had to care for ourselves, that the government wasn't going to help us. Social service agencies were not going to help us. Certainly, ambulances, police, etc., were not going to help us. And even doctors and nurses were afraid to help us. And, it was something that we ourselves had to understand and care for the sufferers and look for cures on our own.
I remember a chilling anecdote that you include in the book where your partner, your wife, tells you if your friend gets sick, not to tell them he has AIDS because they won't come.
Yes. Yes, I always remember that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What's the reception now?
Well, it's hard to say.
I'm delighted to see that it's being taught.
It is taught in different classes. Every once in a while I hear about somebody teaching it. And it's, there's a book that came out recently called Lesbian Love Story by a woman named Amelia Pasanza. The book got quite a bit of attention. And it's about her, she's much younger than me. I think she's in her 30s, I'm 72. And she writes about her search in the archive. It's called, I can't remember the exact subtitle, but anyways, it's about her search for sort of antecedents and ancestors to her as a young lesbian, trying to figure out relationships with, women lovers, with gay male friends. And the last chapter of the book is actually about hospital time and about my friendship with Mike Riegel. So that was one reason why there was sort of a slight revival of attention to this book, in addition to the fact that, it gets taught in classes at a university level. Amelia kind of brought it forth to a more popular audience, which I was very honored about and kind of surprised and also very happy to see.
Absolutely, because it deserves attention, from all age groups. In Hospital Time, you contrast biological and chosen families. You've also written a book about family. Do you think that the contrast is as stark today as it was in 1997?
Yes, I do. I think, certainly for a lot of LGBTQ people, it's been very important for us to find a chosen family of love and support, and because often we haven't gotten that from our biological families. And I think in some places and for some people that's maybe less true than it used to be, but it's still there. And I think it's still important for queer people to have a family of friends and lovers.
One thing that you really nailed, I think, was when you're talking about Mike's funeral, how his brother comes in with all his, patriarchal, nuclear family, heterosexual entitlement. And that really seems to apply.
Well, Michael was pretty alienated from his family. I mean, his family did not. He grew up very working class in Gary, Indiana. His father was a steel worker. Gary is, now part of the Rust Belt. All of that work has gone. Mike, even though he never wanted to admit this, was a real intellectual. I think he was the first person in his family to go to college. He had a PhD in linguistics. He spoke several languages. He loved learning languages and travel. And so and also he'd come out as a gay man and a very radical gay man. So I think his family had no understanding of him. And certainly, when he became sick with AIDS, they were not there to take care of him. The people who cared for Mike also didn't have a steady partner. So the people who took care of Mike were really people like me who knew him, who had been friends with him. And we were the people who helped him get through all that, not his family. And that was true for many people with AIDS. That the families often rejected them when they became sick.
And one thing, a very striking and admirable feature of the book is your unflinching look at not only him, but at yourself and your role as a caregiver. And you mentioned, this reminded me, I read a novel recently which has a section, and one of the caretakers becomes jealous when other people come. And that you mentioned that. I feel like writing the novelist and saying, Patrick, you got it right. Because that was so refreshing. I mean, it's all so real and authentic, Amy, and it must have been very difficult to write. And so you're to be commended for that.
Oh, thank you. I mean, the other thing, as a caregiver for Mike, and also I've had a lot of other, for better or worse, a lot of other caregiving experiences since then, is you can never do it right. And you never feel like you're doing enough or the right thing. And I struggled with that a lot with Michael, and probably more with him than with other people.
And you came through for him. I mean, and that's really what counts. You have that section about loving each other, and you never said you loved each other, but you were there.
Yeah. And I was also exasperated with him a lot of the time. I mean,
sure.
It's a difficult relationship.
But there are no pure saints or pure victims. It's so real.
Absolutely not. And that's one of the reasons I felt like it was important to talk about him. I mean, the only, at the time, the only person, well, there was a young boy named Ryan White who had gotten AIDS from a transfusion, and there's a AIDS Care Act named after him. Finally, when Congress realized this was a huge epidemic, there was passage of this law to help people with AIDS named after Ryan White. He's an innocent child. And then the other person who kind of turned around the AIDS epidemic was Rock Hudson when he died of AIDS. The movie's, very handsome movie star who people already admired. So people like Michael, who was sort of impoverished, crazy, according to many people, full of eccentricities and contradictions, and working for, a marginal newspaper, they were not the people who the media looked at.
And that leads me to another question that I want to ask that I didn't review. How did you decide what to explain and what to assume? Like the White reference, or, I get it because I'm sort of your age. I got a lot of it, although I still didn't know stuff. but like the Revere problem in the other book. But how did you make that decision? I mean, I think it's a good one because it makes everything very clear. But one problem I have, like in interviews, is assuming the audience knows things and not explaining it.
Certainly, if I was writing a book about AIDS now, I would explain a lot more than I do in hospital time. In fact, I realized when I just read that introductory passage, you have no idea I'm talking about AIDS.
But then it
I
becomes
mean, it becomes pretty clear later in the book, but that initial passage, you know, for better or worse, doesn't say anything about who's in the ICU and what is he suffering from and what's going on. You have to kind of find your way in. I just, and you probably know this, I was just finished working on a collection of essays by Urvashi Vad, who was an LGBTQ activist who died 3 years ago. She was a dear friend of mine, and her sister Jyotsna and I edited a collection of her writings, which is going to come out in April from Duke University Press. But one of the things that we had to do as we were editing was footnoting like crazy, because she, in her writings, she refers to people and places and incidents that I don't think the audience would necessarily remember, because we were choosing essays from throughout her life. So some of them refer to things that may have happened a couple of decades ago. And probably if I were writing something like Hospital Time now, I would do a lot more explaining and possibly footnoting.
And it's, she wrote the foreword to Hospital Time. Or
She did. She did, and we thought about including it in the book, but it's not too specific about Hospital Time. We decided not to. I like the foreword of the book very much because what Urvashi talks about in that foreword is what you mentioned before, queer family and biological family.
One last question on this topic. Do you think there's AIDS amnesia in 2024? And if so, how can we fight it?
I do think there's AIDS amnesia. I wrote an essay a couple years ago about the Stonewall 50 celebrations, which, as someone pointed out to me and I gave a lot of thought to afterwards, there was almost no mention of AIDS during those.
I read that essay. I read that anthology. Very interesting. You're right.
And that was, looking at the queer movement specifically, and there was, in all of the talks and exhibits and celebrations and everything, there was very little about AIDS or about some of our, our artists and politicians and activists who died of AIDS. There was very little mention of the people we'd lost or the people who we hadn't lost, who were caregiving, who were survivors. It just wasn't there. And certainly when I've given talks to younger people in college classes, for example, really the only people who know anything much about AIDS are those who have a family member who had AIDS. So if they had an uncle or a cousin or someone in their family or in their friendship circle, they know something, but they know very little. And including, they don't necessarily know much about how to protect themselves. I mean, sex ed courses are being flashed all over the country. So there's really concrete effects of this AIDS amnesia. I mean, younger people, they have no way of knowing about it. They're not being taught about it. But as far as, the Stonewall 50 celebrations and things like that, I suppose it was just to, they wanted to do something upbeat. And of course, the AIDS epidemic there's no way to look at it as something positive. there were a lot of courageous people and caring people and sensitive people involved in it, and it gave rise to a lot of activism. And I suppose you can see all of that is, I suppose, positive, but it was also, you know, people going to 3 funerals a day. And I think that's definitely been, that experience has definitely been lost. I hope that there's more writing about it and more talking about it. And I think it's, I guess, part of our responsibility as people who survived it to continue to harp on it.
Well, your book is certainly an important contribution to that project. I just remember I taught 13 Elegies for Raj, Paul Manette's book, and in his introduction, you said, of course I'm paraphrasing, all I want to do is tell you how much I loved him and how terrible this calamity. And your ending, the Kaddish, I think, is similarly powerful. So, go ahead.
Well, when I wrote that, I was feeling like, the Kaddish is a Jewish prayer for the dead, and it says nothing about death. It's really just a prayer praising the power and the power of God, basically. And I felt like I'm not at a place where I can say Kaddish for my. I mean, besides the fact that I'm not a believer, but the mood of the prayer was not something that I was ready to embrace at that time.
Should we turn to the second memoir?
Sure, if there's time.
Yes. We have pictures now.
Oh, okay.
So, you talk about your time at Gay Community News, which was founded in 1973 and finally closed its doors in 1999. And let's look at a picture of the founders in 1973. And what I like about it is it's at somebody's house, not at a corporate office building. I mean, it's just the grassroots nature of it that is so appealing. Now, you were there from 1978 to 1982. And
I was on the board for a couple of years after that.
Yes. And there's a picture now of you and some of your colleagues when you were working there.
Yes.
What has been the reception of this memoir?
Again, reception is hard. First of all, I don't like to read reviews of my work. I feel like I'll pick out the one negative thing that someone said and obsess about that and never write another word. So for a long time, I really didn't read reviews. But I've gotten very good feedback from people who either had read GCN and had a relationship to it, or who didn't at all and felt like this was something new that they wanted to learn about. Virtually every time that I gave a talk about the book, someone would come up to me and say, the first thing I did to come out was to read a copy of Gay Community News. It was, as you were describing, it was an incredibly grassroots project. It was always underfunded and written and mostly run by volunteers. Those of us who did got paid like $50 a week when I started. And yet it had I think an outsized influence for what it was. For one thing, I always have to say this, it's important to remember that there was no email, there was no internet, there were no computers. So the ways that we learned information about what was going on in our community was phone calls, letters that people put in the mailbox, So and GCN attempted to be national. It probably mostly focused on Boston and New England, but we covered news from all over the country and even the world when we could find it. And we had subscribers all over the country, and some even internationally. And it was one of the few ways that people could find out what was going on culturally, politically, in the news about queer people. You have to remember also that none of that was covered in the mainstream press. The New York Times did not allow the use of the word gay until 1980 something. And
Was it 80 or 1999? I could have that wrong.
not 99, but it's sometime in the
Right.
80s.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, now you can open a paper, the Globe or the Boston Globe or the Times, covers news about the queer community and our institutions and our culture and all kinds of things. That was just inconceivable. Inconceivable.
And, I lived in Boston between 78 and 84. And I remember it was a fixture in
Yes.
our community. And was thinking about your experience, which was very well described. And it seems to me like maybe it was such a thing that you were so immersed in it that it takes, 10 or 20 years to recognize the significance of your work. Because it's
Oh, yeah.
the way you
Yeah.
describe it was very intense, and everybody was I remember those times also from another angle. Everybody was so committed and, arguing about everything. And
Yeah.
about the book, you start with some literary references, and you include Virginia Woolf, Moby Dick, James Joyce, Simone de Beauvoir. And you say, apropos of Moby Dick, that GCN was your white whale. Would you
Well, I
mind?
said it was my Yale and my Harvard, which is a quote from Moby Dick. I didn't say it was my white
Good for
whale.
you. Good. Sorry. Thank you for the correction. I
No,
read it.
well, it wasn't, that would be a whole different thing. But what I meant was that so many people, who go to college, middle class people who go to college, the people they meet there are there, and their experiences there form their sort of their friendship group, their lovers, their intellectual base, and that was not true at all for me. And GCN was the place that I got all of that. I mean, most of the people I'm close to at this time in my life, including my wife, I met at GCN.
And you end the book with a wonderful scene of you on the beach with, unfortunately, Urvashi Bad is gone, but you're all, many years later, as I recall.
That was the first thing I wrote.
Really? And then you went backwards. Well, it works.
It ended up at the end of the book, but it was the first thing I wrote.
Well, let me recommend to the audience these very great features. You talk about your experience at the Michigan Women's Music Festival, which is a hoot. You talk about the Saints Collective and the Somewhere bar, and there were two bars, and I was living there, but I didn't know anything about this rivalry that they had. I went to
Well, rivalry sort of. I mean, again, it's hard to imagine this because the bars are just not the same kind of, don't have the same kind of place in our community as they did at that time. But there were a lot of lesbian bars in Boston.
remember
none
the
of them.
Marquee? And there was another one.
The Marquee was in Cambridge. There were several in Boston. There was one, well, there was a gay bar out in Allston. Also a couple in the suburbs. So there were just queer and specifically lesbian bars all over the place that we don't have anymore.
No, it was a whole different culture. You also talk about picketing cruising, and I picketed cruising too, if I may be, but I didn't go and see the movie afterwards. But
Michael
all that
Brown's-
wonderful historical detail that you include is really, really refreshing.
Well,
And
Michael Bransky, who I mentioned earlier, Michael claims that people picketed it and then ran inside to see it because it was one of the few places that you could see images of a queer bar and of leather bars in particular.
And it gave me a new vision of Elaine Noble, because when I was just coming out in Indiana in '75, I saw her and Leonard Matlovich speak, and I was just worshiping her in awe. She was involved with Rita Mae Brown, and I thought, okay, this is lesbianism, but I guess she's a little compromised in certain ways.
Well, she was a groundbreaking figure. Elaine Noble was the first openly lesbian to be elected to statewide office, and that was really important. And Leonard Matlovich came out, in the Army, and of course immediately got himself kicked out. But they were both, they were both really important figures and also really divisive figures in other ways, which is always true. Nobody's, we don't have any saints in our movement.
I hate to mention it because this is a really bad turning point, but would you mind talking about the fire in 1982? Believe it or not, I was watching local news that night, and I saw you standing in front of with all the rubble, with all the emergency. I think you must have given an interview to the local news.
I probably did. I was there. The GCN office, which was on Brownfield Street in downtown Boston, was destroyed in an arson fire in July 1982. And the cause of the fire has never been absolutely determined. Has not been, as far as I'm concerned. There was a group of discontented, this came out several years later, there was a group of discontented firemen who were starting arson fires in various parts of Boston, which sounds bizarre, but apparently that's not so strange. They, I think, wanted to bring attention to, I don't know what exactly, their working conditions, or they needed more money or something, but anyways, I don't think that answers the question of how they chose their targets and why they, if they were indeed responsible for the fire, why did they light the fire in this obscure office building in downtown Boston? So that's why I say it's never been solved to my satisfaction. I mean, at the time we thought it might be the landlord, because I think he wanted to gut the building and renovate it. But actually, the building has not been touched since then.
That's amazing.
It's
that's prime real estate.
Oh, I think that's not the landlord, or he would have done something with it.
I was at that office. I heard Jan Clausen read from her collection. Mother, yeah, and so when I was reading about it, I sort of had a feel for it. And let's show a picture now of you speaking at the Arlington Street Church talking about the fire. Arlington Street Church was a hub, as you note.
Yes, the Arlington Street Church was a Unitarian Universalist church, and they were one of the first denominations to accept queer people and to ordain them. And the Arlington Street Church is a historic church in downtown Boston. They used to ring the church bells when the Gay Pride Parade marched by and cheer us on, which was, as you can imagine, extremely unusual for any church, mainstream or otherwise, at that time. So they also opened their sanctuary to radical and left and queer events. I mean, I remember going to a lot of different kinds of events at Arlington Street Church.
This is a broad question, and I don't know if you can answer it, but what would you say was the impact of GCN then, and what is its legacy?
Well, that's interesting. Last fall we did with the Boston LGBTQ History Project did a series of panels to recognize the 50th anniversary of the founding of Gay Community News. And we, one of those did focus on GCN's legacy. I think the legacy is, well, in part how it affected people at the time. Because, as I said, it was one of the only ways we had of communicating with each other about what was going on among us, who was doing what was going on culturally, what was going on politically. I was once interviewed by this reporter from the New York Times who was writing a book about the gay movement, and one of his questions to me was, no, never mind. I won't talk about that. But when I was doing these panels about the Stonewall 50, one of the moderators said, how was the riot covered in the media? It wasn't covered in the media.
No.
It was covered in, there were a couple articles in the Village Voice, and there was a piece in the end, buried in the Times, but that is it. People found out about the Stonewall riot from the gay grapevine.
Right.
We found out about it from each other. We did not find out about it from seeing it on the news or reading it in the newspaper. I mean, it's delusional to ask that question.
And I think, I'm glad you mentioned the History Project, because if you go on their website, I listened to all those panels. They were great.
Thank you.
I could put a face to the people you're talking about in the book, some of them.
Yes. Well, so in terms of legacy, as I said, I think some of it was just its effect on the movement as a whole at that time, because it was spreading the news and connecting people. And also because it's a document now of what was going on historically. I mean, the issues exist. It's available at the whole run of it is available in the Northeastern Library Archives and at the Boston LGBTQ History Project. And so that also shows people what was going on, at least in the more radical part of the movement at that time. And I think that history, that archival history, is really important. And I think it still reverberates into the present because, as I said, of the effect that it had just on our organizing and our politics.
Pardon me?
I mean, and on our politics. GCN was clearly part of, even though we said we were a forum for the whole movement, we were definitely on a particular side. And I feel like throughout gay organizing, there have been kind of a debate about whether to see our issues as narrow or as expansive. And there was a constant debate in GCN about what is gay news. Do we cover a demonstration against the U.S. involvement in Central America? Our answer was yes, for a lot of reasons, and we could explain it, and it's not like there weren't queer people in El Salvador. But there's another section of the movement, I guess, which would say, no, we want to focus very clearly on issues that are about gay rights. And I feel like they still don't grapple with the fact that, as Urvashi writes a lot in her book, queer people need health care. Queer people need poverty programs. We need housing. We need protections for our families and our kids. And so, the issues that touch us are huge. And I think GCN always saw the movement as one that touched on many other movements. And I think that we were important in developing that kind of politic.
Before we run out of time, I want to make sure that we talk about your current project. What's coming out in April? and what can we anticipate, and how's it going? And
Well, as I mentioned, I've been working with Jyotsna Vad, who is Urvashi's sister, on editing a collection of articles by Urvashi, and I think it will, I hope that other people find it as thought-provoking and inspiring as I did. That is coming out from Duke University Press in April, if everything goes according to plan. There's an introduction to the book by Tony Kushner and a lot of blurbs by people like Rachel Maddow, so I hope that will encourage people to read it. And so I was busy working on that, you know, for the past, I don't know, year or so. Jyotsna did an amazing job of going through Urvashi's computer records and archives and finding some really wonderful unpublished speeches and material that's not available anywhere else. And we also excerpted chapters from some of her published work, her book, Virtual Equality, which came out in, I think, 1997. We have a long excerpt from that. And there's also some very sweet photographs and a lot of other stuff in it. There's a section of letters that she wrote to her family right after she got out of college and was sort of developing her politics and her activism. So anyways, I've been busy with that for a while. And
what's it called?
oh God, it's called The Dream of a Common Movement.
That's great.
Selected Writings of Urvashi Vad.
Excellent.
Yes.
And
Jyotsna came up with that. She's great at titles, and that's a title that she came up with. I love it.
That's great. Yeah, it fits. You're probably going to be promoting that and going around and doing book tours.
I hope so, yeah.
And you said you, at some point in these memoirs, you said you had another novel in progress?
Oh, well, yeah, I've been working on and off on a novel, but right now I'm not feeling that connected to it. I'm not sure what to do with it. I'm not into it right now. There's too much else going on in my life.
Yes. Yes. Well, we're drawing to a close. This has been a wonderful conversation, but before we leave, I'd like to ask you for last words, valedictory commentary. What do you want to say to the audience? Well, I asked you this question before.
I thought I gave you some good last words about gay community news.
You did. The last time you emphasized community when I asked you this question.
I think actually I would say that, and I think especially since the election, a lot of people in a lot of different communities are realizing that this is what we all need, is to gather with our communities to figure out what we need and to really fight for it. It's not going to be an easy, the next several years are not going to be easy, and there's going to be, I'm afraid, a lot of suffering and difficulty. And so I think we need to turn to each other more than ever and not only support each other, but really figure out how to fight for what we need and the kind of world that we want.
Well, you could say an army of ex-lovers cannot fail.
Well, maybe, yeah.
Amy Hoffman, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real delight.
Well, it's been a pleasure to talk to you, and I really appreciate being invited on your show.
Well, you've made such important contributions in your life, but also in these memoirs. They're really worth talking about and encouraging readers to read.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. And until next time, remember, resist.